Apple has been feeding iOS and iPadOS gamers a steady diet of AAA games. First, we saw the launch of Resident Evil Village back late last year, followed up by Resident Evil 4 and Death Stranding. And this month's launch of Assassin's Creed Mirage for iPhones and iPads marks the last of Apple's promised big-budget game releases from the iPhone 15 event last summer. This release promises a full-fledged version of a good-looking and technically advanced Assassin's Creed title, but it does come with somewhat muted expectations given the inconsistent technical quality of those prior games. So how does Mirage fare on iPhone hardware? And what lessons can we take away from the recent spate of AAA games on iPhone, including Capcom's new Resident Evil 7 port? Assassin's Creed Mirage is very substantially downgraded on iPhone. Perhaps the most striking cutback is the huge reduction in asset quality. Assets that look pretty good on Xbox One are decimated badly on iPhone, suffering from much lower texture resolution. Pretty much everything looks far blurrier, and the difference is obvious even on the iPhone's small format display. Perhaps a more elegant solution would have been to reduce the quantity of environmental assets, but the density of models appears largely unchanged between the Xbox One and iPhone versions. I suspect this may be in part motivated by getting the install size down, as at just shy of 12GB, the iPhone version is about half as large as its 8th gen console counterparts. Some lighting effects, like bloom, are toned down or absent on iPhone. If you look at this shot, it looks like the volumetric lighting on the One has been stripped out of the iPhone version. Shadows aren't quite as pin sharp on iPhone either, though I think they hold up well enough. But there are a lot of elements that haven't been downgraded. Take draw distances for instance. Across my comparison shots, draw distances for crowds, static geometry, and shadow maps appeared very similar across the two versions. Crowd density might take a small hit, but the NPCs that are present pop in at a similar distance between the two versions. This is a bit surprising given how easy it is to hide pop-in on a mobile phone display. Post-processing looks quite similar between the iPhone and One S again, with both employing SSR, depth of field, and even a touch of per-object motion blur at times. I actually think the SSR looks a bit better on iPhone as it resolves with much less flicker. This probably comes down to the form of anti-aliasing in use, which on iPhone appears to be Apple's Metal Effects temporal solution, which is a DLSS-like reconstruction solution that taps into the iPhone's neural engine. On consoles, it's a more standard TAA technique. In broad strokes, the two versions of the game look similar, and the basic visual character of the game is preserved on iPhone. It's really just the massive reduction in texture quality that sticks out here because everything else is similar enough. Then there's image quality. On iPhone, the internal resolution is extremely low. On the high graphics setting, it counted in at about 300p in the shots I tested, with about 680 pixels horizontally owing to the iPhone's ultra-wide aspect ratio. Because of that Metal Effects upscaling pass though, the image looks far crisper and cleaner than what its internal resolution would imply. I'm guessing it's upscaling to something in the vicinity of 720p. The Xbox One version appears to come in at an internal resolution of roughly 828p by my counts in contrast. The iPhone is definitely presenting a less detailed and more artifact-ridden version of the game than Xbox One, but it mostly holds up okay on the iPhone screen. The biggest issue here comes down to artifacting around moving elements like characters, which can be obtrusive. In motion, the game often looks quite jagged and presents a lot of strange-looking edge details, but considering just how low-res the game is at its core, I'd say Metal Effects Temporal is putting in some solid work here. It's worth noting as well that cutscenes are generally presented in 16:9 form, so you do lose some horizontal resolution in scripted sequences. So far we've been looking at the game in its high visual preset, which presents the best looking version of the game for cross-platform comparisons, but it has two other visual options as well, the medium and low presets. The primary difference between these modes comes down to draw distance. On the high preset, we're just about on par with Xbox One, while the medium and low presets progressively, but gently, pare back the image. Some things like the posts here are simply not rendered at range, while foliage tends to use static, lower detail models, but still appears at roughly the same distance from the camera. Shadows are clearly a bit lower res too. It's not a colossal difference, but it is definitely noticeable in head-to-head comparisons. On the low preset, NPC shadows only draw quite close to the camera as well, relying on screen space shadows further afield. The complexity of the water rendering also takes a hit as we scale back the mode settings. On the high preset, we get quite beautiful water with nice wave deformation and solid screen space reflections. The medium preset loses the waves, with surface undulation only represented with normal maps, and the low preset drops the SSR as well. Resolution-wise, all three presets appear to come in at approximately 300p internally, and all appear similarly detailed for the final image, suggesting a similar rendering setup, with Metal Effects Temporal in use across all three. So graphical quality is pretty decent, but what about performance? The high preset tends to run very poorly. We're very often in the low to mid 20s here with plenty of frame time variation. We do have a 30 FPS cap in place, but the game rarely reaches that target. Dense city areas like Baghdad are the worst affected. The game isn't unplayable, but it's far from a smooth experience. I'm capturing this framerate data with my iPhone set to 60Hz to provide more accurate framerate readings from our capture. If we step all the way down to the low preset, Mirage does turn in a better performance level. In calmer areas like the town in the game's intro, the game is at 30 FPS more often than not. There's definitely some substantial slowdown in the mix at times, but it's an okay overall experience, I'd say. Baghdad does present some extra strain though, and the game can hover in the mid-20s for extended periods. It's still often at 30 FPS though, or at least close to it. The medium preset falls somewhere in between, though it's usually closer to the high preset. I'd strongly suggest playing Mirage on the low settings preset if you do choose to play it on iPhone. The performance level is at least acceptable some of the time. Choosing the other presets guarantees poor performance in just about every area, and the visual uplift they offer is usually pretty mild. To be fair to the iPhone code, the 1S version also suffers from extended sub 30 FPS bouts. The framerate isn't as variable on Microsoft's last-gen machine, but the 1S doesn't cope especially well with this game. To get a more stable framerate, you really need to step up to a 1X, or any of the current gen systems, which offer solid 30 FPS and 60 FPS modes. There are other performance issues though. Occasionally, you may spot a little geometric animation in the top right corner of the screen, which apparently indicates the game is autosaving. During this period though, the game can pause. These pauses really take you out of the experience and pop up frequently when traversing city areas. Typically they last a few seconds, but in some cases they seem to go on indefinitely. Here I waited about 20 seconds or so before reloading my save. I noticed some glitches too. The pathfinding for this NPC seemed to break during the game's first mission, for instance, and the reins for the camel here didn't animate properly or connect correctly with the camel's mouth. I didn't notice any glitches in my gameplay on game consoles, so I suspect these issues are specific to Apple devices. Plus, in common with other demanding games, your iPhone will likely turn off some system functions after a few minutes of gameplay, like the flashlight and 120Hz refresh rate, to preserve as much thermal capacity as possible. Mirage isn't quite what I'd like it to be. On the one hand, it's a visually compelling translation of a very good-looking home console game, but its performance issues seem severe at times. I have to imagine that this is a very demanding game for an iPhone 15 Pro, but the results are probably not good enough for most players, especially considering the game's glitches and autosave issues. Less complex games seem like a better fit for Apple's 2023 flagship phone. A good case in point is Resident Evil 7, Capcom's first RE engine game, which launched earlier this month. Settings-wise, we get a decent degree of configurability, with the game offering 3 settings presets in addition to a resolution slider. The base performance mode has some moderate downgrades here, taking hits in shadow resolution and texture resolution and dropping SSR, though it generally looks just fine on an iPhone display. The big revelation here though is that in this mode, Resident Evil 7 is mostly a 60 FPS experience at a 720p display resolution. It does drop frames sometimes and can suffer from brief but severe framerate dives, but in general play we hit that 60 FPS target. More surprising though is the game's performance level with a balanced preset. 720p gameplay here gives us a consistent 30 FPS, and unlike prior AAA releases on iPhone, this time it's mostly a properly frame-paced 30 FPS. We do see the occasional 16 millisecond frame, but that's a far cry from the likes of Resident Evil 4, which targeted 30 FPS but suffered from serious frame time inconsistencies. Controls do feel a bit laggy at 30 FPS here, I'd say, but the actual frame delivery is good. A game like Resident Evil 7, which was designed to hit 60 FPS on base last-gen consoles and to run smoothly on the original PSVR, seems like a better fit for an iPhone than games like Death Stranding, Resident Evil 4, and Assassin's Creed Mirage. RE7 looks great and features excellent materials and lighting, but it has very constrained environments relative to those games. Perhaps that causes less pressure on streaming systems or RAM use, two areas where I suspect these titles may be struggling on iPhone. RE7 also, interestingly, doesn't tax my iPhone to the point where it turns off basic system functions, like the flashlight or a 120Hz screen refresh rate. I do wonder if having the iPhone in that less thermally limited state might open up higher peak frequencies, especially on the CPU, helping to power through spikes in load. We observe similar behavior sometimes on PC handhelds, where frequencies can take a hit under heavy load because of power contention between the CPU and GPU. In any case, RE7 seems like a better fit for the iPhone than titles like Assassin's Creed Mirage. Other more conservative last-gen titles, like Alien Isolation and Wreckfest, also work pretty well, but that upper tier of last-generation efforts seems to be a bit too ambitious for Apple's current flagship, at least judging from the results over the past 8 months or so. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitaldefender.net for exclusive and early access content and to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.